Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's video. On today's video, we're in session 3 of our new series, which is entitled Prove the Complexity Factors. And in this session and in this series of discussions, we're talking about how your QME report needs to be documented for the Division of Workers' Compensation and also for the claims administrator in order for both of those parties to be happy with your use of the complexity factors, which are a component of the medical legal fee schedule under California Code of Regulations 97-95. And in video number 1 of this discussion, we talked about two things. Number 1, how it's now more necessary than ever before that you document, and prove your use of the complexity factors. And we made an analogy that proving your use of the complexity factors is a lot like qualifying your opinions and conclusions within the body of your report as substantial medical evidence. When you run your opinions and conclusions in your report through the filters of substantial medical evidence, the opinion that falls out of the bottom of those filters or those funnels is an opinion that is what we refer to as substantial, meaning that it has some meat, it has some merit, and there's a reasonable medical probability that that opinion is actually the true, correct, and accurate opinion because it has successfully survived the filters. Well, similarly, in qualifying your complexity factors and improving your complexity factors, there's a series of steps involved with proving that your use of the complexity factors complies and comports with the exact language of the law as these complexity factors are described under CCR 97-95. So it's now more important than ever that we comply and prove our use of the complexity factors. In so doing, we can, number 1, of course, importantly, we can get our reports paid at the amount that we're expecting to be reimbursed for those reports with no questions, no reductions, and no disputes. So that's number 1. And then number 2, we can satisfy the Division of Workers' Compensation that we're not overbilling our reports, that we're not abusing or misusing the complexity factors, as many doctors have been accused of and have been found actually guilty of recently. So that was what we talked about in video number 1. And then in video number 2, we talked about what are the complexity factors that you can work on, that you can capture, and that you can prove even prior to the face-to-face evaluation with the injured worker. And we're talking here in that video, we were talking mostly about the review of records complexity factor, and then also the causation complexity factor. And we talked about how to set up the causation complexity factor in the separate section at the beginning of your report, and also in the causation section of your report, so that that complexity factor is already captured by way of cover letters even prior to meeting the examinee in the face-to-face evaluation. And in this way, once the complexity factor is captured, it then directs the sequence of questioning and the sequence of events in the face-to-face evaluation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in today's discussion as well. So, in our last session, we began the concept of proving the complexity factors by talking about those complexity factors that can be captured prior to the face-to-face evaluation. And in today's discussion, we're going to talk about one more complexity factor that can be captured prior to the face-to-face evaluation. And then we're going to go into some of the complexity factors that have to be captured at the face-to-face evaluation. And I'm talking specifically about the apportionment complexity factor, and I'm talking also about the prior multiple injury complexity factor. So we'll get onto those discussions here in just a very few minutes. But first, I want to talk to you about the remaining complexity factor that can be captured at the face-to-face evaluation, and that's the complexity factor that has to deal with what the Division of Workers' Compensation refers to as a prior written agreement. A prior written agreement. So for today's discussion, I've provided you a couple of resources that you can download and print out so that you can follow along with our discussion, and that includes number one, the Division of Workers' Compensation's new proposed language for the complexity factors, and this is a new proposal effective May 18, 2018. And then in addition, I've provided you with some counter language that's been proposed to counter the Division of Workers' Compensation's new proposed language. So we can think of these two sets of descriptions of the complexity factors as residing on opposite ends of the spectrum. On the one end of the spectrum, on the conservative end of the spectrum, we have the Division of Workers' Compensation's interpretation or new proposed language for the complexity factors on the one hand, and then all the way on the other hand, on the liberal side, is a new proposed counter language to the Division of Workers' Compensation's conservative language. So we're going to see in today's discussion, and I've provided these for you as references for today's discussion, we're going to see the two ends of the extreme, from extremely conservative language involved with the complexity factors to extremely liberal language involved with the complexity factors. And I'm going to give some suggestions as to how to capture these complexity factors regardless of where we fall along this spectrum as these issues related to the complexity factors get sorted out here over the next several weeks and months. So go ahead and download today's references so that you can follow along with me. And I'm going to go ahead and retrieve my notes as well. And I look forward to being back with you here in just a very few moments as we begin and continue along with our current discussion involved with prove the complexity factors. So I'll be back with you here in just a very few moments. Okay, I'm back with you now and have my notes and references with me here. I hope you have your notes and references as well so that you can follow along and see with your own eyes some of these changes that I want to share with you today as relates to the proposed language proposals promulgated by both the Division of Workers' Compensation and then the counter proposed language as proposed by the Los Angeles attorneys that have been so involved with these complexity factor disputes over the past 1 to 2 years. So to begin, we're talking in this discussion about how to prove your use of the complexity factors. And we finished up our last discussion by talking about some of the complexity factors that you can attack and prove prior to the face-to-face evaluation with the injured worker. And I have one more complexity factor to talk to you about. And that has to do with the prior written agreement under ML 104. So the prior written agreement under ML 104, and I'll give you the current language of that as it's described in CCR 9795. So under the ML 104, it describes a comprehensive medical legal evaluation for which the physician and the parties agree prior to the evaluation. So when does the agreement have to be obtained? It has to be obtained prior to the evaluation. That the evaluation involves extraordinary circumstances. That the evaluation involves extraordinary circumstances. So it goes on, it says, when billing under this code for extraordinary circumstances, the physician shall include in his or her report, number one, a clear, concise explanation of the extraordinary circumstances related to the medical condition being evaluated, which justifies the use of this procedure code. So it's a two-part requirement in order to capture the prior written agreement. Number one is that you have to obtain a prior written agreement from the parties prior to the evaluation. And then number two, in the body of your report, you have to include a clear, concise explanation of the extraordinary circumstances related to the medical condition. Okay, and so this is an important nuance. In the language of the law, it says that the extraordinary circumstances have to relate to the medical condition being evaluated. So it says that the extraordinary circumstances have to be related to the medical condition. That's different than extraordinary circumstances related to the evaluation. The nuance is that the extraordinary circumstances have to be related to the medical condition. So this is the premium complexity factor. Of all the complexity factor, this one here is hands down, bar none, the most valuable of the complexity factors. Because when you capture this particular complexity factor, all of the other complexity factors that comprise and construe the ML104 drop off. They become unnecessary to qualify for the ML104 if you can capture a prior written agreement from the parties. So if you can capture a prior written agreement from the parties, you automatically secure and capture the ML104 regardless of your face-to-face time. You capture an ML104 regardless of the review of records time. You capture an ML104 regardless as to whether or not causation is an issue in the evaluation. You capture an ML104 regardless of whether apportionment is an issue in the evaluation. So when you can capture and obtain a prior written agreement from the parties, you automatically qualify for an ML104 irrespective and irregardless or regardless of the other complexity factors. So it's the premium complexity factor. Now, interesting is that under the current language of this complexity factor, we're allowed to bill for our time involved with report preparation. Now, prior to the QME settlement agreement, which solidified the current language, which reestablished the current language, prior to that, under the DWC's interpretation of this complexity factor, this was the only complexity factor for which we could bill and be reimbursed for our report preparation time. Well, we now, under the QME settlement agreement, we are now getting paid for our report preparation time under all descriptions of ML104, not just this description. But there are the DWC's new proposed language is expected to cap our report preparation time to no more than 3 hours, except under this particular description of the ML104, which involves a prior written agreement. And the new proposed language states, and let me just read some citations from the new proposed language. This involves, this complexity factor involves a comprehensive medical legal evaluation for which the physician and the parties agree prior to the start of the evaluation that the evaluation involves extraordinary circumstances. It goes on, it says, any request by the physician for an agreement that an evaluation involves extraordinary circumstances shall be accompanied by a statement by the physician articulating the factors and extraordinary circumstances related to the evaluation that justify the request. So if you can able to articulate the factors and circumstances that are extraordinary, and if you can capture a written agreement from the parties prior to the start of the evaluation, none of the other complexity factors are necessary. So it's no longer necessary that you spend 6 or more hours involved with any 3 of the complexity factors. It's no longer necessary that your report address a disputed issue of medical causation. It's no longer necessary for your report to capture apportionment by discussing 3 or more injuries to 2 or more injuries to 2 or more body systems, or permanent impairment due to 3 or more employers, or any of those other qualifiers under the apportionment complexity factor. So this is the premier complexity factor. Now, under the DWC's prior interpretation of the complexity factors, more and more doctors were seeking a written agreement in order to capture the ML104 and in order to be able to be paid for their report preparation time. So we have some experience in successfully obtaining prior written agreement from the parties. Now, I need to tell you that obtaining a prior written agreement from the parties is not easy, because the parties have no incentive and no motive to provide you with a prior written agreement that allows you to fully capture all of your billable hours. This is the only code that allows you to capture your billable hours for all activities involved with the production of the report. The parties have no incentive or motive to do that for you. The parties, of course, are busy themselves. The parties, of course, have no interest in taking the 30 minutes that it's required to produce a new Microsoft Word document that they send to you and copy to all of the parties in the loop that allows you to, or that agrees with you that the evaluation involves extraordinary circumstances. The parties have no incentive to do that. So getting the parties to do that is very difficult. Similarly, another difficulty that doctors have described in obtaining the prior written agreement from the parties is that they simply run out of time prior to the face-to-face evaluation, and they fail to be able to obtain the written agreement prior to the start of the evaluation. So for that reason, it's my recommendation that you schedule the evaluation 6 weeks or more from the date that you receive the call for the QME appointment. And then you persist and persist and persist in the weeks preceding the face-to-face evaluation, that you persist in obtaining this prior written agreement. And it's only through persistence and actual badgering of the parties that you may successfully be able to obtain a prior written agreement. Now, it's also been my experience and the experience of my subscribers that obtaining a prior written agreement wherein the parties agree that the evaluation involves extraordinary circumstances is predicated on one basic premise. And guess what that premise is? The premise is that the parties are only going to agree that the evaluation involves extraordinary circumstances when what criteria do you think has to be fulfilled in order for the parties to agree? What do you think it is that has to be satisfied in order for the parties to take the time to write you a letter to agree that indeed, in their opinion, they agree that the evaluation involves extraordinary circumstances? Well, that criteria is and can only be that the evaluation truly is extraordinary. You're only going to be able to get a prior written agreement from the parties that the evaluation is extraordinary in those cases where the evaluation is truly extraordinary. So if you have a run-of-the-mill case that is not extraordinary in any way, you're not going to be able to get the parties to agree to it. So don't try and get the parties to agree that a case is extraordinary in those cases where the case is truly not extraordinary. Now, you have to be able to impress the parties in your request for a prior written agreement. You have to be able to impress them. You have to be able to convince them. You have to be able to enlighten them. You have to be able to elucidate to them the factors of the evaluation that are extraordinary. Or else, guess what? They won't see the extraordinary circumstances. And they won't provide you with the prior written agreement. So I want to share with you a correspondence that I had with some parties wherein I requested a prior written agreement that the evaluation involved extraordinary circumstances. And I want to share with you how I elaborated to the parties the extraordinary circumstances and how I was able to enlighten them and educate them and elucidate to them those factors that on my end contributed to the extraordinary nature of the evaluation to the extent that they were compelled to take the time, to take the effort, and to take the energy required to send me a written agreement in advance of the evaluation. So it started when I received the stack of medical records. And as I said, I'm suggesting that you set your evaluations no earlier than 6 weeks from the date that you receive the appointment call, preferably 7 weeks, and in some cases, even using the extent of the full 60 days from the date of the appointment call. Okay, and this is what will allow you sufficient time to get the medical records and then to get a prior written agreement in those cases that appear to you to be extraordinary. Okay, so on one particular day, I received a stack of medical records that was a substantial stack of medical records. It was probably an 18-inch tall stack of medical records. Several reams of paper, 4 to 5 reams of paper. Well, this was the first signal or first indication to me that this evaluation involved extraordinary circumstances. So after reviewing the medical records, I was able to discern that there was dispute over 3 dates of injury, that there were disputes over the number and type of body parts injured in each of these 3 different dates of injury. For some of these dates of injury, there was concern about prior industrial injury and prior award of permanent disability. And there was multiple overlapping concerns for causation and overlapping concerns for body parts and overlapping concerns for permanent impairment and apportionment. So it seemed to me that the evaluation was complex. So I authored a letter to the parties. And I'll just cover up the parties and let's go over the letter now. It starts by stating, "Dear parties," it says, "on such and such a date, I received a stack of medical records." And I included here a photo of the medical records. So I don't know if you can see this or not, but here's a photo of the medical records. They're sitting there on my desk. And as you can see, the stack of medical records is about 18 inches tall and includes several reams of paper. So I wanted the parties to be impressed with the copious quantity of medical records that I received. So it included a photo of the medical records. The letter goes on to say, upon review of these medical records, along with the December 15, 2017 cover letter, copy enclosed from Attorney Brown, it is apparent that the upcoming evaluation involves extraordinary circumstances relating to the medical condition or conditions being evaluated. Although not a complete list, extraordinary circumstances related to the upcoming evaluation include, and here I list some of the extraordinary circumstances related to the upcoming evaluation. So number one, there's some extraordinary circumstances related to medical causation. There's some extraordinary circumstances related to prior medical history. There's some extraordinary circumstances related to apportionment. Okay, and so let's discuss these one by one. With regards to medical causation, there was extraordinary circumstance related to AOE and COE. So number one, there was issue related to AOE COE for an industrial injury dated 3/25/15. There's an issue of AOE COE for an industrial injury of 6/1/2017. There's an issue of AOE COE for an industrial injury of 8/24/17. So 3 dates of disputed industrial injury. Also related to causation, there's an issue of body parts injured in an industrial injury 3/25/17, the first injury. The body parts injured in industrial injury 6/1/2017, the second injury. And body parts involved in industrial injury of 8/24/17 of the third injury. So with regards to causation, AOE COE, there were concerns for the presence or absence of an industrial injury on 3 specific dates. There was also a dispute as to which body parts were involved in any or all of those dates of injury. And those were the issues, simply the issues related to industrial causation. With regards to prior medical history, it seemed that there was a history of prior industrial injury. So, for example, there was a prior history of an 8/22/2000 industrial injury to upper extremities, not specified. Upper extremities, not specified. There was concern for a April 13/2005 industrial injury to upper extremities, not specified. There was concern for a December 10/2007 industrial injury to arm above the wrist. There was concern for prior non-industrial injuries due to 2 prior motor vehicle accidents. So these were some of the prior medical history that was discovered by review of the medical records. I was able to discover that there was 3 prior industrial injuries long before the concern for the 3 current industrial injuries. In fact, the 3 current industrial injuries came almost a decade after the latest of the 3 prior industrial injuries. And then also somewhere within that mix, there was at least 2 prior motor vehicle accident injuries that involved same or similar body parts. So that was the discussion as related to the prior medical history. Then with regards to apportionment, there was concern for Labor Code 4663 apportionment to the 8/22/2000 industrial injury to the same or similar body parts. There was concern for Labor Code 4663 apportionment to a 2005 industrial injury to same similar body parts. There was concern for Labor Code 4663 apportionment to 2007 industrial injury to same similar body parts. There was concern for Labor Code 4663 apportionment to prior left wrist carpal tunnel syndrome surgery. There was concern for Labor Code 4663 apportionment to prior right wrist carpal tunnel syndrome surgery. There was concern for Labor Code 4663 apportionment to prior right shoulder rotator cuff repair surgery, and there was these multiple prior industrial injuries, all of which could potentially impact the apportionment determination. So therein was the discussion related to some of the extraordinary circumstances related to apportionment. Okay? So in this case, the extraordinary circumstances that I was able to elaborate involved concerns for causation, involved concerns for prior medical history, and involved concerns for apportionment. Well, the letter goes on to say, this is not a complete list, but this still serves to highlight the complexity and extraordinary circumstances involved with the upcoming evaluation. And from there on out, after that first sentence, I then went on to elaborate on the Division of Workers' Compensation's new requirement that we obtain a prior written agreement in advance from the parties in those cases that involve extraordinary circumstances. And I concluded the letter by stating that I know and understand that this requirement is new to you. It is new to us evaluating physicians as well, and I apologize for the inconvenience that this will cause you in preparing this written agreement. However, you can anticipate this request from other evaluating physicians because, as stated above, this new requirement is actively being enforced by the Division of Workers' Compensation Medical Unit. And in scheduling subsequent qualified medical evaluation appointments since this, and since speaking with claims administrators since this, many of the claims administrators expressed to me now that they're becoming more familiar and more experienced with QMEs requesting this prior written agreement. So the claims administrators and the parties have had enough exposure to this request for prior written agreement that the chute has already been greased. So in those cases, when you have a truly complex evaluation, it pays. It pays to prepare this written agreement and have the parties simply sign it and send it back to you prior to the evaluation. If you're actually able to obtain a prior written agreement, which is based upon actually having a complex and extraordinary evaluation in front of you, if you're able to obtain this written agreement, it obviates the need for all of the other complexity factors and firmly solidifies the ML104, and this can be done even in advance of the face-to-face evaluation with the examinee. So this applies in those circumstances wherein you truly have a complex evaluation. The parties will have no problem endorsing your agreement for extraordinary circumstances in those cases where the evaluation truly is extraordinary. But the burden is still upon you to educate the parties, to illuminate to the parties, and to elucidate to the parties the factors of the evaluation that are extraordinary, and this is one such way that has succeeded in convincing the parties of the extraordinary circumstances. Okay? So along with the review of records, along with establishing the causation complexity factor, now in addition to those two, prior to the face-to-face evaluation, you can establish the ML104 complexity factor by obtaining a prior written agreement from the parties, and this has to be done prior to the face-to-face evaluation. So now let's go on to the face-to-face evaluation and talk about those complexity factors that are established at the face-to-face evaluation. And those complexity factors include number one, your face-to-face time. Your face-to-face time. And let me get my notes correct here. Yeah, your face-to-face time. Number two, again, causation. And then number three, apportionment. All of these are established at the actual face-to-face evaluation. Now, both apportionment and causation can be set up and captured prior to the face-to-face evaluation, but it's at the face-to-face evaluation that you complete the complexity factor, that you do the work necessary to fully capture and fully document to the parties that your argument and your sections in your report labeled causation and labeled apportionment, that those truly qualify as complexity factors. And it's here at the face-to-face evaluation that you do the work of sending your opinions and conclusions through the filters, so that what pops out of the bottom is an opinion or conclusion that qualifies as substantial medical evidence and that truly qualifies as a complexity factor as described under CCR 9795. So let's just quickly go through these and let me share with you some ideas as to how to capture these complexity factors. So number one, with regards to the face-to-face time, it's important that the examinee be your advocate or be your proponent when it comes time to quoting or citing the face-to-face time. I can't tell you how many times I've heard from the examinee, either from the examinee's own mouth or in written transcripts, such as in a deposition transcript, wherein the examinee cites to the parties the amount of time that they were with you in the evaluation. So, for example, when the examinee is with me in a face-to-face evaluation for 4 hours and later goes on to be deposed, in the deposition transcript, I can't tell you how many times I've reviewed wherein one or the other of the parties asks the examinee about their evaluation with me, and the question comes up as to how long was the examinee with me. Well, you want the examinee's response to that question to be the same as the amount of time that you billed for in your complexity factor. So it begins by making the examinee familiar with the face-to-face time. And this starts even prior to the face-to-face evaluation in your confirmation call to the examinee. So in the days preceding the face-to-face evaluation, when you call the examinee to confirm their upcoming appointment, you simply let them know about how long you expect the evaluation to take. So a script on that might go something as follows. Hi, Mr. Jones. This is Becky from Dr. Carpenter's office. I'm calling to confirm your appointment for this Thursday's qualified medical evaluation. Are you confirmed for that appointment? Oh, yes, I'm confirmed for that appointment. Okay, great. Well, I'm just calling to let you know several things, one of which is that the evaluation could take anywhere between 2 and 4 hours. And I'm just making this up as an example. You should have a good idea as to approximately the range that will be required for the evaluation, and give the examinee approximately a 2-hour range. So the evaluation could take somewhere between 4 and as many as 6 hours. And make sure that the examinee knows that they need to secure that time block out of their day, and make sure that they know that they could be with you for some time, somewhere between 4 and 6 or 3 and 5, or give them specific numbers and make sure that they're familiar with the specific numbers in case they are required later to quote the specific numbers. Okay, do you get it? So it starts by advising the examinee and making the examinee familiar in advance with the approximate time that the evaluation will take. Number 2 step in establishing your face-to-face time is to start the evaluation precisely on time. So if the evaluation is scheduled to start at 9 a.m., you bring the examinee back to the room at 8:57 and get them situated in their chair so that you begin your preparatory remarks and your preparatory procedures exactly at the start time, which in this case is 9 a.m. So you might, the script on that might go something as follows. Okay, Mrs. Jones, let's begin. I see that we're right on time. It's now 9 o'clock. I'm ready to begin. Are you ready to begin? And you get their head nod on the quoted start time. And you might even refer to your phone, or you might even refer to the wall clock that's behind you. But make sure that the wall clock that is behind you says 9 o'clock when you quote 9 o'clock as the start time. So make sure that the examinee is familiar with the start time. Number 3 is to make examinee aware of the start time. Okay. Number 4, ask the examinee to quote the stop time. So when it comes to the conclusion of the face-to-face evaluation, your script might go something as follows. Okay, Mrs. Jones, if you have no further questions, we can conclude. What time do you have? And the examinee will pull out their phone. They will look at their phone and they will quote the phone time, and they will tell you it's now 12:37, and you will write 12:37 down as the time that they quoted you. If the examinee does not have their own phone, or if the examinee is unable to quote you, you can quote the time by referring to your phone, or by referring to your watch, or by referring to the wall clock behind you, and making sure that the examinee has a chance to observe the time on your phone, the time on your watch, or the time on the wall clock behind you, and you quote the time. Okay, it's now 12:37. The evaluation is now over. And then you simply have the examinee initial the start time and the stop time on a prepared form that you bring to the evaluation. And the examinee will have no difficulty doing this because you already established that the start time was at 9 a.m. and you're now establishing that the stop time, in their own words, is 12:37 p.m. You then have them initial both of those times, and then you take this time worksheet and you submit it with the report. And in the separate section at the beginning of your report, wherein you're quoting your complexity factors, you would simply say, complexity factor 1, 2 or more hours of face-to-face time by the physician with the examinee. Total face-to-face time with Mrs. Jones was 217 minutes, which is in parentheses 3 point something hours. Please see enclosed time worksheet initialed by Mrs. Jones for start time of 9 a.m. and stop time of 12:37 p.m. for a total face-to-face time of 217 minutes. And I'm making this time up. But the point is that you include the start and stop times in the body of your report, and you include the time worksheet signed by the examinee along with your evaluation report. And this is how you prove the complexity factor of face-to-face time. I can't tell you how many doctors throw out face-to-face time values that are rounded off, they're not exact, and they're not backed up by a written statement by the examinee. And guess what? I wouldn't pay for it. If I was a claims administrator, I wouldn't pay for it, and I don't think you'd pay for it either. If you received a report that said face-to-face time with Mrs. Jones was 3 hours, first thing is you would suspect that those times were rounded times. They're not exact times to the minute, and you want to quote your face-to-face time to the minute. Also, it's not backed up by any documentation by the examinee, which makes it suspicious, which makes it not proven. And the whole philosophy of this discussion is that it's now more than ever necessary and required that we prove to the parties beyond any shadow of any doubt that what we're billing for under the complexity factors qualifies as a complexity factor, and number 2 is a true and accurate representation of our use of that complexity factor. Okay? So that's the face-to-face time. Let's talk now about a couple of causation issues that are solidified and captured during the face-to-face evaluation. And probably the most important principle as relates to the causation complexity factor has to do with knowing the type of evaluation that you're into before you even go to the face-to-face evaluation. So recall that qualified medical evaluations are ordered under three separate labor codes. Labor Code 4060, Labor Code 4061, and Labor Code 4062. And each of these labor codes and each of these reasons for ordering the qualified medical evaluation have to deal with different issues. So cases are ordered under Labor Code 4060 that involved denied cases, that involved disputes over AOE and COE. Similarly, cases that are ordered under Labor Code 4061 involve their own issues, and evaluations ordered under Labor Code 4062 involve a separate set of their own issues. So under Labor Code 4061, these are evaluations that are ordered due to disputes over permanent disability, the presence and extent of permanent disability, and then evaluations ordered under Labor Code 4062 involve disputes over other medical determinations made by the primary treating physician, such as permanent and stationary status, such as apportionment percentages, such as work restrictions. So it's important to know under which labor code the evaluation was ordered even before you go to the face-to-face evaluation, because knowing that in advance directs the evaluation. Let me give you an example. If you know that the evaluation was ordered under Labor Code 4061, you know that the evaluation involves a dispute over permanent impairment. Well, if the dispute is over permanent impairment, it tells you that the case has been accepted and that AOE COE is no longer in dispute. So you can tailor your face-to-face evaluation with the examinee to focus in on issues related to the permanent impairment dispute, and you can steer your evaluation away from lines of questioning and procedures that are involved to resolve AOE COE disputes. Okay? So the approach that we take in each of these evaluations differs based upon the disputes. So it's important to know going in advance if the evaluation was ordered under Labor Code 4060, 4061, or 4062. And let's just go over some of the issues just to demonstrate this principle related to disputes under Labor Code 4060. Okay, we won't have time to talk about disputes and evaluations ordered under Labor Code 4061 or 4062, but let's just highlight and illustrate this principle by delving into some of the issues related to Labor Code 4060, okay? So under Labor Code 4060, these are the denied cases. These are the cases that the claims administrator has denied liability for the case, for the claim, and the injured worker now is requesting a qualified medical evaluation because the law allows the examinee to get a qualified medical evaluation under Labor Code 4060. It's Labor Code 4060 that gives them the right to come and have a face-to-face evaluation with us so that they can attempt to convince us that an industrial injury took place and that their claim for industrial injury should move forward. The law gives them this right. So we see these cases. So because the dispute under Labor Code 4060 involves AOE COE, we know that the dispute does not involve a dispute over permanent impairment. So during this evaluation, we're not going to be doing a permanent impairment evaluation. We're not going to be assessing the examinee for permanent impairment because the dispute does not involve the extent and the presence and extent of permanent impairment. The dispute involves whether or not there was an industrial injury or not. Okay? So The procedures of the face-to-face evaluation are much different. The physical exam, for example, can be much briefer if we don't have to assess for permanent impairment. We don't have to do all these multiple range of motion measurements. We don't have to use digital inclinometers and all these procedures described in the AMA guides because we're not doing a permanent impairment evaluation. We're doing a compensability evaluation under Labor Code 4060. So, some of the issues that you're going to explore and investigate during the face-to-face evaluation so that you can fully capture causation as a complexity factor are number one, AOE. So AOE involves whether or not the examinee has a bona fide medical condition. And if the examinee does have a bona fide medical condition, the question then becomes, is it reasonably medically probable that that condition could have been caused by the workplace activities and the injury in the way that the examinee described the injury to have occurred? So let me say that again. The whole concern with AOE has to do with, number one, does the examinee have a bona fide medical condition? And many times examinees will present to us with pathology. They will have bona fide medical conditions. So don't be confused by pathology. Pathology does not equal causation, but the causation analysis begins with an identification of the pathology. So the question is, does the examinee have a bona fide medical condition? And if so, is it possible? No, let me rephrase. Is it reasonably medically probable, 51%, that that condition could have been caused or contributed to by the industrial injury to have occurred in the manner, the way that the examinee described it to have occurred? So that's your investigation into AOE. You will also want to investigate into COE as well, although in the body of your QME report you want to steer away from discussions related to COE and focus in on discussions related solely to AOE. But still, nonetheless, it's valuable to explore COE to assess the examinee's credibility and also to determine whether or not there are any other red flags that are suspicious for a fraudulent claim. So some of the concerns related to COE have to do with the circumstances of the exposure, whether or not the incident of injury was a witnessed incident of injury or an unwitnessed incident of injury, whether or not the examinee promptly reported the industrial injury or whether or not there was a delay in reporting the industrial injury. In other words, are there any red flags associated with this claim for an industrial injury? And in these cases, it's very likely that you're going to unearth red flags that have already been identified by the claims administrator, which has caused the claims administrator to go ahead and deny the claim. So don't be surprised by pathology. Don't be surprised by the presence of red flags. You still have to come to a determination that qualifies as substantial medical evidence, and if you're able to do so, you can fully capture causation as a complexity factor. Okay, a couple more issues related to causation. What is the medical treatment received? Number one, has the examinee received medical treatment inside of the medical provider network? Or number two, has the examinee pursued treatment solely outside of the medical provider network? And again, in those cases where the examinee pursues treatment outside the medical provider network, it's usually indicative of a represented injured worker who is pursuing treatment outside the medical provider network on the referral of their attorney, and they're pursuing treatment outside the medical provider network and directing their own treatment outside the medical provider network because the claims administrator has denied the claim. The claims administrator has discontinued or declined the provision of medical treatment benefits within the medical provider network. So this leaves the control of the medical care in the hands of the examinee, and gives them the opportunity to select their own physician to provide the medical treatment. And then finally, issues of causation related to the Labor Code 4060 evaluation have to do with a history of same or similar condition. So by fully exploring these causation issues and fully knowing the type of evaluation that you're getting, whether it be a Labor Code 4060 evaluation, a 4061 evaluation, or a 4062 evaluation, tells you down which road you're going to pursue your interviewing techniques and also your physical examination procedures. So the issues involved with a Labor Code 4060 evaluation related to causation are different than the issues related to causation in a 4061 case, which are different from the issues related to causation in a 4062 case. But we won't go into each of those. However, I elaborate on some of those issues in your course notes for today's discussion. Okay? Now, we're about out of time in today's discussion, so we're going to pick up in our next discussion on apportionment as a complexity factor and how to capture apportionment as a complexity factor in the face-to-face evaluation. And then after that, we're going to conclude this program by talking about how to prove those complexity factors that you capture and secure after the face-to-face evaluation. So to reiterate, some of the complexity factors we can capture before the face-to-face evaluation, some of the complexity factors we capture at the face-to-face evaluation, and some of the complexity factors we capture after the face-to-face evaluation. So we're discussing the whole spectrum of how to prove each and every complexity factor. So doctors, I hope this helps you. The philosophy of this discussion is that it's essential that you be able to prove to the parties beyond any doubt that your billing for complexity factors is legitimate and that your use of the complexity factors complies with the exact language, the exact written language of the law under CCR 9795. Now, you can expect many changes in these complexity factors over the next weeks and months as the parties come to some agreement between the two extremes of the languages that have been proposed. Well, regardless of where we end up on the spectrum, it's always going to be necessary for you to document to the parties that you deserve to be paid for your use of the complexity factors. And just as you scrutinize any invoice when someone presents you with an itemized invoice, the parties are scrutinizing your invoices as well. And they're learning great detail about you through your use of your billing and through your use and through your reflection of your use of the complexity factors within your billing. So it's essential that your billing be perfect, be an exact representation of the truth, that you not misuse the complexity factors, that you don't abuse the complexity factors, but that you use the complexity factors exactly the way they're described in the language of the law. So I hope this helps you, doctors. And I want to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's video. Look forward to being with you on future videos as well as we continue our ongoing discussion entitled Prove the Complexity Factors. So for today, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'm wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.